If Vivian Evans had bullied me like a normal person, I probably would have figured her out months earlier. But that was the problem. Vivian wasn't normal. Typical school bullies operate efficiently and predictably. They throw barbs, shove you in the hallway, laugh loudly when you mess up, and quickly move on to the next victim in search of cheap entertainment. Vivian didn't move on. Vivian specialized. She didn't terrorize the whole school. She didn't even bully me in the broad sense of the word. She tormented me with such frightening, targeted precision that it looked less and less like cruelty and more like a long-term research project where I was the sole subject. Every morning, she noticed me first. And I'm not saying this in a romantic sense, but in a purely tactical one. If I came to my locker 5 minutes early, she was already standing there, as if she'd sensed my discomfort from another floor. If I skipped breakfast, she informed me of it before second period. If I wore a decent jacket, she called it annoyingly acceptable. If I showed up in a stretched out hoodie, she stated that I looked especially pathetic today and considered it her civic duty to sit across from me the entire lunch period, monitoring my level of decline. It would have been much easier if she had been ugly. That's a cruel thought, I know, but it was damn accurate. But Vivian was beautiful, with that sharp, aristocratic beauty that turns every unpleasant word into an attack on multiple fronts. Tall, dark-haired, with a piercing gaze and a face that never looked relaxed, as if softness were a luxury she didn't trust. She moved as if the hallway was obligated to part for her, and as a rule, it did. By October, the whole school had accepted the axiom: if I was somewhere, Vivian would materialize there. She usually preferred a tactic of gradual escalation. She'd give me 5 minutes of illusory peace, then make a dramatic entrance to criticize my coffee, my bag, or whoever had the misfortune of standing too close to me. Take Tuesday morning, for example. History class, 8:15 a.m. I sat down next to Mia Harper, simply because the seating chart had changed and because, contrary to Vivian's beliefs, I had the right to communicate with women without special permission. Mia smiled at me and asked, "Do you have Friday's notes?" I had just reached into my bag for my notebook when I heard the screech of a chair behind me. Slow, deliberate, like a soundtrack to someone's very bad decision. Vivian dropped into the seat directly behind me. "His handwriting is too messy," she cut in, not even looking at Mia. "I wouldn't bother." Mia blinked. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, and turned around. "You're absolutely insufferable, you know that?" Vivian calmly uncapped her pen. "Good morning to you too, Adrian." She asked me a question, and I answered, more honestly. "No one asked you." Her lips twitched. It wasn't a smile. It was that barely perceptible expression of triumph that appeared every time I lost my cool. My irritation was like a personal vitamin cocktail for her. Mia, to her credit, assessed the sparks flying between us and quickly retreated. "Never mind, I'll ask someone else." As soon as she turned away, Vivian said quietly, "Good." I stared at her point blank. "What is your problem?" She raised her impossible eyes to me and answered in that same cold, calm voice. "That's too philosophical a question for 8 in the morning." And that was the essence of it. You couldn't win cleanly against Vivian. Every conversation turned into fencing, where her sarcasm bordered on obsession and her rudeness bordered on frightening attentiveness. In the cafeteria, she helped herself to 2 potatoes from my plate without asking. "You keep buying food as if you were raised at a gas station." "Then don't eat it," I snapped. "That's not how quality control works." "You're not quality control." "No," she took another fry. "I'm your social consequence." Mason, sitting next to me and enjoying the show far more than a friend should, whispered in my ear, "You know, there's something kind of hot about this." I kicked his chair under the table. He just grinned wider. Vivian, of course, noticed that too. "What did he say?" "Nothing." She narrowed her eyes. Lie. Mason made the worst choice of his life. He leaned forward and said straight to her face, I said you're suspiciously obsessed with him. A dead silence fell over the table. Vivian looked at Mason, then at me, and then said with absolute icy calm, I'm the only person in this building who's truly attentive. That phrase should have made me angry, but instead it sent a chill somewhere under my ribs, because it was the truth. Vivian noticed details everyone else ignored. She knew when I changed my coffee brand, knew why I hadn't worn my watch for 3 days, the strap broke, knew when I was having a bad morning and had tied my tie crooked. She sensed when I went quiet in class because something was gnawing at me and I didn't want to talk about it. One day in chemistry, I dropped my pen. Before I could bend down, Vivian had already picked it up and placed it on my desk without even glancing my way. 2 minutes later, she whispered, You're distracted today. You're a walking disaster, I muttered, not looking away from the board. But you're not denying it, she countered. By November, the school had theories. Ava thought Vivian had the most aggressive crush in human history. Mason believed she was one step away from carrying your photo in a locket. Tyler just thought we were practically dating already if you lower your standards for emotional health. I hated those theories, but most of all, I hated that they no longer seemed like nonsense. There was a system to her behavior. Vivian was always there, always watching, always interfering, and, strangest of all, she got much angrier when someone else tried to claim my attention than when I snapped back at her. Regular bullies cool off over time. They get bored. But Vivian remained focused, personal, specific. The last straw came on Thursday. I was standing by the bike rack talking to Lena from the Lit Club. She just needed notes. Can you send me the outline tonight? Lena asked. You always explain things better than the teacher. Why are you talking to him? She appeared out of nowhere. Vivian. Hand on her bag strap, face a mask of feigned indifference that only cracked for me. Lena's gaze shifted from her to me and back. I needed notes. Vivian drilled her with a stare for exactly 1 second. Sounds like a temporary necessity. Lena, whose survival instincts were better than most, muttered, I'll text someone else, and vanished almost instantly. I slowly turned to Vivian. You can't keep doing this. She lifted her chin. Doing what? This. You still need nouns, Adrian. I laughed, shortly, bitterly. Don't play dumb. You're making my life hell because any girl within a 5-meter radius automatically becomes your personal enemy. For the first time all day, her vaunted composure glitched. Just a little. A shadow of confusion in her eyes. It's not what it looks like, she said quickly. Then what is it? She looked away. And that was a revelation for me. Vivian never looked away first. Only if the truth was too sharp to say out loud. I stepped closer, close enough to speak quietly without caring if anyone else heard. You know what? I've had enough. Enough of being your favorite target. The words hung in the cold air. Vivian snapped her head up, her eyes boring into mine. Enough of what? Being the one person you spend all your time on. The one you watch, hunt in the hallways, and guard in the cafeteria. Vivian's face changed. There was no guilt or anger in it. There was something more dangerous. Silence. You finally noticed, she whispered. That shut me up. If she had started denying it, I might have still pretended we were playing ordinary school rivalry. But she didn't. She just looked at me as if I had finally read the right chapter and now had to live with that knowledge. What the hell is that supposed to mean? I asked. She adjusted her bag strap. Her fingers trembled slightly, though her voice remained firm. It means you're slow. And she just walked away. No explanations, no final jabs. I stood by the bikes in complete silence, watching her disappear behind the science building. She had just confirmed what I had been afraid to think about for months. You finally noticed. It wasn't that she was bullying me. It was that I was the one she chose. And when I got home that evening, only one thought was in my head. I won't let Vivian Evans keep making me part of her life until I find out why. The next time she decides to walk away, I'll follow her. Stalking my own tormentor after school, an activity devoid of any dignity whatsoever. I understood that perfectly. I accepted it. And I did it anyway. Because after Vivian's "You finally noticed," delivered with the air of a queen in exile, no version of me could have slept peacefully without answers. So on Friday, I waited. This was the first and most pathetic part of my plan. Usually, after the last bell, I either left with Mason or took a huge detour past the gym to avoid people and pretend that walking was a form of emotional regulation. Instead, I stood by my locker, rearranging papers I'd already sorted twice. Mason saw right through me instantly. "Why are you torturing that folder? Did it offend your family?" "I'm thinking," I replied without looking up. "That never ends well." Agreed. He leaned against the neighboring locker and stared at me for a long time. Then his face changed. "Oh no." "What, oh no?" "You're planning something insane." "That's too broad a definition, but accurate." I slammed my locker shut. Mason grabbed my sleeve. "Adrian, this is either the beginning of a great love story or a criminal case. Are you sure you have enough information to choose?" I pulled my sleeve free and walked away before he could come up with another frighteningly accurate metaphor. I saw her by the exit. Vivian was standing by the water fountain, one hand against the wall. She wasn't talking to anyone, wasn't on her phone. Just paused for a second, head bowed, as if waiting for the school noise to fully leave her system before stepping into the outside world. And that was strange. Vivian at school was all sharp edges, biting comments, and flawless steel. But this version of her, from the side, when she didn't know I was watching, looked tired. Not tragically, no, just humanly. I gave her a 5-second head start and followed her out. Outside, it was that nasty November cold that makes every building seem even more hostile than it already is. Vivian walked across the parking lot, never slowing. No farewell waves, no stops for small talk. The farther she got from school, the quieter and less noticeable she became. I stayed half a block behind her, feeling like an amateur psycho. Vivian never looked back once. She moved with that same efficient, closed-off energy as always, but now there was no theatricality, no audience. At the corner pharmacy, she stopped. On instinct, I ducked behind a parked SUV, feeling maximally degraded. But she was just waiting for the crosswalk light. She crossed the street and headed toward the quiet residential neighborhoods west of campus. This was already farther than I'd expected. Somewhere, subconsciously, I had believed that Vivian existed only within the school perimeter, in the hallways, on the parking lots, within the bounds of my patience. But now, she was walking past bakeries, past flower shops, past people she had never insulted in chemistry class. With each block, she looked less like a public menace and more like someone else entirely. She went into a small shop and came out with a paper bag and a carton of orange juice tucked under her arm. Ordinary orange juice. For some reason, that detail stuck in my memory. It was so normal. 3 more blocks, a turn, and she stopped at an old brick building with black railings and a front door that clearly stuck. Vivian gave the handle a familiar tug and disappeared inside. I stood across the street, staring at that door. I recognized the building. My mom had once said the apartments there were great if you weren't afraid of steep stairs. This was where I should have stopped. I knew where she lived. That was already too much. Already overkill. I should have gone home. But the remains of my common sense, apparently, had gone on strike with picket signs. I crossed the street. The lobby smelled of old carpet and mail. I stopped, listening. Silence. Then, the sound of a door closing somewhere above. I walked over to the mailboxes. V. Ivanova, 3B. That should have satisfied me. But satisfaction had left the chat when I heard quick footsteps on the stairs. She was coming back. Vivian appeared on the landing, already without the juice, so she must have run up home and immediately come back down for her mail. She saw me instantly, and froze. For a second, we just looked at each other. "What are you doing here?" she asked. I would love to say I had a witty answer ready, but no. I told the truth, which sounded even worse. I was following you. Vivian stared at me point blank. "That's deeply humiliating for you, Adrian." "Fair." "You were tracking me." "Yes, because yesterday you said something insane and just ran away." "That doesn't clarify much." "You know exactly what I'm talking about." She held my gaze, then slowly descended the last step, maintaining her height advantage by a couple of centimeters. Of course, she couldn't help it. "You came to my house. That's unhealthy." "Probably." "And you're admitting it?" "I'm standing in your lobby, Vivian. What's the point of denying it?" The corners of her lips twitched. Not a smile, a ghost of a smile, which, for some reason, made me even angrier. "Don't do that," I said. "Do what?" "That almost smile, like this amuses you." Vivian's face went stone cold again. "But it is a little amusing." I exhaled. "So you live here?" "That's generally how addresses work. Are you alone?" That was the wrong question. I knew it the second it left my mouth. Vivian's face changed. Not much, but enough for me to realize I had accidentally stepped on something very personal. "Yes," she snapped. No details. And suddenly, the whole picture of Vivian, this invulnerable, all-knowing girl who did nothing but ruin my life, shifted again. Here, in the dim light of the entryway, she didn't look invulnerable. She looked exposed. Not weak, no, but stripped of armor. "You're different here," I said quietly. She shot her eyes up. "What do you mean, different?" "Less," I hesitated. "Cruel?" she offered. "No." I answered too quickly for it to be a lie. Vivian looked at me for a second, then said, "That's unfortunate." "Why?" "Because it means you're actually looking." There was that word again, attention. It hung between us like gravity. She walked over to the mailboxes, pulled out a couple of envelopes with the same sharp efficiency she did everything else. "You need to leave, Adrian, before the neighbors decide I collect boys." That's a frightening way to put it. And accurate enough to be dangerous. I smiled involuntarily, and she noticed. Her gaze lingered on my face half a second longer than necessary before she looked away. Her face softened, genuinely. For a moment, she looked like someone who had simply gotten too used to attacking because leaving things as they were was too hard. She turned toward the stairs. "Goodbye, Adrian." I should have let her go, but I said, "Vivian." She stopped halfway, not turning around. "What?" "I'm not done yet." Silence. Then she slowly turned and looked at me with an utterly unreadable expression. "That makes two of us," she threw back, and she went upstairs. I stayed in the lobby with a racing pulse and the realization that my stalking hadn't given me answers. It had only made the question bigger. Because whatever Vivian was doing at school, this obsession, this jealousy, this quiet war between us, it clearly didn't end at the school gates. And now, I knew where it all went after the bell. To apartment 3B, where she was completely alone. And I really, really needed that information. I shouldn't have come back. Let's establish that as fact. Any normal person, after tracking their tormentor to her home and learning enough to make the situation definitively unstable, would have gone home, eaten something unhealthy, and spent the weekend diligently not thinking about Vivian Evans. But by Sunday, I was no longer a normal person. I stood before her building with a paper bag in my hand and a plan that didn't deserve an ounce of respect. In the bag was orange juice. This was the worst part of the scheme. The juice pretended I had a reason, when in reality, I had simply remembered that she was carrying it on Friday. For some reason I didn't want to analyze too deeply, that detail had gotten stuck in my head. So now I looked like a man bringing tribute to the woman who had turned his life into a nightmare. I pressed the button for 3B. Silence. Pressed again. The speaker crackled to life, and Vivian's flat voice responded. What? Terrible greeting, I said straight into the mic. Pause. What are you doing here? I brought juice. A long silence. So long, I seriously began to wonder if she had walked away from the intercom out of sheer second-hand embarrassment for me. Then the lock clicked. I climbed the stairs. The steps seemed louder than usual, reminding me that I had no script and no clear reason. The apartment door was slightly ajar. Vivian stood on the threshold in gray sweatpants and a black long-sleeve shirt. Hair down, no shoes, no makeup. And if in this state she seemed less dangerous, for my ability to make adequate decisions, she was a mortal threat. She glanced briefly at the bag, then at me, and silently stepped aside to let me in. And here, the real problems began. The apartment was not at all in Vivian's style. At least, not the Vivian the school knew. Soft lamps, piles of books, a blanket tossed carelessly over the couch, a record player in the corner, and a mug with a spoon stuck in it on the coffee table. The air smelled of coziness and something floral. Nothing in this setting matched the girl who would rather die than admit to liking anything simple and warm. I froze in the entryway, still clutching the juice. Vivian closed the door and stated, "You're staring. This isn't what I expected to see." She took the bag, looked inside, and asked, "Why did you bring this?" "You had it on Friday." "That's not a reason." "That's literally the reason." Vivian carried the juice to the kitchen, clearly deciding whether to be offended or just laugh. I followed her, and that's when I saw it. At first, my brain refused to process the information. Just a black hoodie draped over the back of a kitchen chair. My hoodie. The very one I'd forgotten in the gym locker room 3 weeks ago and assumed was lost forever. I stopped dead. Vivian noticed my gaze instantly, and in that same second, for the first time since I'd known her, she panicked. Not loudly, not theatrically, but absolutely certainly. She darted to the chair, snatched up the hoodie, and crumpled it in her hands with none of her usual grace. "It's not what you think," she blurted. I looked at her, then at the thing in her hands. "That's my hoodie." "No!" "Vivian, my initials are on the tag." She dropped her eyes to the collar, saw the letters, and realized. The denial strategy had failed. The mathematical calculation no longer worked. "Fine," she exhaled. "Fine?" I couldn't believe my ears. She pressed the garment tighter against her ribs. "You left it." "At the gym. That doesn't mean I gave it to you." "I never said you gave it to me." "Then what's it doing in your apartment?" That was the key question. Judging by how her jaw tensed, the answer was too personal to voice. I stepped closer and noticed something else. On the kitchen counter, half hidden under a magazine, lay a wrapper from a protein bar. my favorite brand. On the record shelf, the top 3 sleeves belonged to bands I'd mentioned in her presence only once. On the table stood a black ceramic mug with a chip on the handle, exactly the kind I'd once joked made coffee taste better. I slowly turned and looked around the room again. Now I saw everything differently. The apartment wasn't a shrine to me, no, but it was literally stitched through with details of my life. Small things, habits, preferences, my belongings. Too many to be coincidence. "What the hell, Vivian?" I asked quietly. She froze. "Stop looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're starting to understand something." "I can't stop." "It'll only get worse if you keep looking," she threw back. Well, of course, after words like that, I simply had to continue. I walked into the living room. Vivian followed like a shadow, too close, like a tactical supervisor. "Adrian, don't you dare open drawers." That doesn't sound reassuring at all. I walked over to the bookshelf by the window. On the second shelf, jammed between 2 novels, was my blue mechanical pencil. I pulled it out and held it up. Vivian closed her eyes. "Oh, God." "That's also mine." "Yes." "Why?" "I liked it." "It's just a pencil." "It writes well," she snapped. "That's a fact." I looked at the pencil, then at the hoodie in her hands, then around the room again, and I began to grasp the scale of the disaster. This wasn't random theft or a momentary weakness. It was accumulation, a long, quiet hunt for pieces of my life. Every object in this apartment screamed one thing. Vivian wasn't just watching me. She was collecting me. Once the first clues were discovered, the whole room seemed to rise up against both of us. Now every little thing looked suspicious. Familiar protein bars in the cupboard, that specific coffee on the kitchen shelf, a flyer with a school announcement pinned to her corkboard, with my notes on it from class. I stood in the middle of Vivian's living room, slowly rotating on my axis, like a visitor to a museum exhibit called Psychological Deviations in Home Interiors. Vivian stood frozen by the couch, arms crossed so tightly it looked painful. "Stop spinning," she snapped. "That's the only thing bothering you right now?" "Yes." "Not the evidence of your obsession?" "I prefer to solve problems as they arise." I picked up a black pen from the table. "Why do you have this?" She glanced at it briefly. "You click it too loudly in class." "That's not an explanation. It's the closest available version of the truth." I laughed shortly. "You stole my things because I annoyed you?" "No," Vivian flared, then added more quietly, "not because of that." That phrase changed everything. She admitted that the motive was far more dangerous than ordinary annoyance. I looked around again. The mug, the records, the hoodie she had now carefully folded over the arm of the couch, the pencil, the protein bars, the notes. Then I noticed the corkboard above her desk. There were no photos of me. Vivian was too smart for such cheap, cliched stalking. But there was a system. A class schedule where certain hours were circled. Not her hours. Mine. In the corner was pinned a note. "Coffee truck closed Tuesday / use west entrance." I stared at it, then at Vivian. "That's my route." Vivian said nothing. I stepped toward the board. There were more notes. Lawson's essay moved to Monday. Lab partners swap, week 6. Mia absent Thursday. I slowly turned around. Vivian had gone pale. Not from fear, from shame, which I had thought her organism incapable of. "You were tracking my schedule." "No." I just looked at her until she exhaled through her teeth. "Fine. Yes." Why is Mia's name here? That question hit the mark. Her jaw tensed. Because in October, she was talking to you too much. I let out a laugh of pure disbelief. That's insane. I know. And again, no denial. No attempts to justify herself, just naked truth with nowhere left to hide. I should have gotten angry. Probably. But instead, I felt a strange mix of shock and frightening realization. I was seeing the underbelly of everything that made her behavior at school so unbearable. Jealousy, timing, interference, constant knowledge of where I was and what I was doing. It wasn't coincidence. It had structure. I ran my hand over my face. God. Vivian looked away. Your reaction is deserved, she said quietly. I looked at the girl who built herself up as untouchable every day, and who now looked ready to sink through the floor over the mere existence of this room. How long has this been going on? She gave a bitter, tired laugh. That's not a question you can answer briefly. Still, she looked at the board, then at the hoodie, and finally at me. And in her voice, there was no more of the usual sharpness. Long enough that I stopped noticing what counts as normal. That was too honest. Not the answer of a movie villain, but the answer of a lonely person. I looked around again. The records, the protein bars, the coffee, my belongings she had woven into her daily life. Not because she wanted to destroy them, but because she wanted me nearby, in whatever form possible. I'm everywhere here, I stated. Vivian barely lifted her head. Yes. No defenses, no jokes, just yes. Any sane person with a normal survival instinct would have immediately left this apartment, possibly after delivering a dramatic speech. But instead, I sat down, right there on her couch, 3 steps away from my own hoodie. Vivian looked at me with genuine bewilderment. What are you doing? I leaned back and looked up at her. Processing. It would be easier if you did that somewhere else. No, I cut in. Somehow, this feels like the right place to do it. For a second, I thought she would kick me out. But instead, she sat down too. Not next to me, in the armchair across. Arms crossed, knees pointed toward the door, as if still considering escape. And in that moment, everything changed. This was no longer a confrontation. It was an exposure. And now that I had seen the private architecture of her obsession, we both understood. There was no going back to the bully and victim game. When you see the whole truth at once, the past starts to rearrange itself at terrifying speed. Every strange comment, every sudden appearance of Vivian exactly where I was about to walk, every flash of her coldness the moment another girl spoke to me, now it all had one answer. It wasn't hatred, or even exactly control. It was attention, so constant and dense that it had begun to turn into a strategy. We sat in her living room, surrounded by evidence, and pretending the room was lying was pointless. You were never normal about me, I broke the silence. Vivian looked at her hands, then back at me. That sounds harsh, but it's true. She forced a weak, humorless smile. You say that as if it's news. To me it is. A skill issue, Adrian. I smiled involuntarily. Even on the verge of complete emotional exposure, she couldn't stop being insufferably Vivian. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. Okay, no more maneuvering. Why? That was the main question. Not the things, not the notes, not how my life had become woven into her interior, but the why itself. Vivian held my gaze for a second, then another, and then looked away. For her, that was the equivalent of surrender. Because you were there. That's not enough. It was enough for me. No, Vivian. My voice was steady, though the room crackled. Why me? Her jaw tensed. You didn't look at me the way everyone else did, she finally said, her voice so quiet I had to lean in. I frowned. What do you mean? She let out a short, weary laugh. Guys either act like idiots, or they're scared, or they see me as a trophy to win. But you argued with me. You rolled your eyes. You got annoyed. You treated me like a difficult person, not a problem to solve or a fantasy to drool over. I was stunned. So you bullied me for being normal? I bullied you for staying normal even when I was horrible. That hit the bullseye, because it was also true. I never froze up around her, never tried to impress her, never softened my irritation just because she was beautiful enough to deprive others of their senses. And apparently, for Vivian, that became a fixation point. Terrible origin story, I noted. Yes. And extremely unfair to me. Yes. And honestly, pretty pathetic on your part. At those words, Vivian snapped her head up. The old spark of hostility flared in her eyes. And honestly, it made me feel slightly better for a second. You're sitting in my apartment, surrounded by evidence, and you still manage to sound smug, she cut in. I smiled. You noticed. The spark died as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that same softness she was so afraid of. Which was worse? Because now I saw both versions at once. The girl who had made herself cruel because cruelty was easier to bear than need, and the one underneath, who collected me piece by piece because a direct "I like you" seemed like an unthinkable humiliation. Were you ever going to tell me? I asked. Vivian gave a bitter smile. How? That's not an answer. No, she snapped. That's the whole problem. I let that phrase hang in the air. So all of this, the notes, the hoodie, the hallway intercepts, the territorial behavior, that was your plan? She shot me a withering look. I never had a plan. Seriously? I had impulses and no self-control. It was so honest it almost commanded respect. Almost. You do realize this is insane. I ran through everything I'd seen on her corkboard. Yes. And this can't go on forever. She paused, then answered even more quietly. I know that too. And there it was, the real confession. Not fear of being caught, but fear that now her secret world had touched reality. She had to admit that she had wanted to be closer for months, but never found a way to do it without hurting them both. You could have just... I started and stopped. Vivian looked at me as if I were speaking a language she didn't trust. Just liked you, she finished for me. That seems to be a skill I don't possess. No jokes, no armor, just a fact. And suddenly all her school cruelty made sense. She wasn't bullying me because she hated me. She was bullying me because she loved me too much and had no idea what to do with it except turn it into a war she could control. I looked at my hoodie on her couch. You're still impossible. She smiled faintly, a shadow of her former smile. I know. And somehow, that was the gentlest thing we'd said to each other all day. After I saw her room, my brain refused to return to normal mode. Every event of the past few months started replaying in my head with new commentary. All those hallways, lunches, stupid jabs that once seemed like random bursts of bile now looked frighteningly deliberate. I had the whole weekend to digest it, and believe me, it was the worst diet of my life. By Monday, Vivian's apartment had literally rewritten school reality. Now, looking at her, I didn't just see the Ice Queen, I saw that corkboard, my hoodie, the protein bars she bought because I liked them, the fact that in her private space, I had become part of her routine long before I even noticed I was being watched. The status quo wasn't just broken, it was ground to dust. In the morning by my locker, she appeared beside me as usual, leaned against the neighboring door and tossed out, "You look tired." Before, I would have heard mockery. Now I heard something else. "I know how your face changes when you think alone too much." In the cafeteria, out of habit, she fished a fry for my plate. "You always buy the worst food on Mondays." Before, I would have heard irritation. Now I heard, "I've been tracking your weekly rhythm for months." It was unbearable. "Stop doing that," I said, putting down my fork. Vivian raised an eyebrow. "Doing what?" "Talking as if you didn't turn my worldview upside down in your apartment on Saturday." Mason, sitting across from us, froze with a piece of pizza in his mouth like a deer in headlights. Vivian didn't even flinch, but her gaze grew heavier. "You're being dramatic in public, Adrian. And you're keeping my hoodie a secret." Ava made a sound suspiciously like a victory cry. A dead silence fell over the table. You could hear someone drop a spoon at the other end of the cafeteria. Vivian looked at me with a long, unreadable gaze. "Are you trying to destroy me in front of witnesses?" she asked icily. "The feeling is mutual." Mason slowly stood up. "You know what? I'm leaving before this conversation becomes grounds for a lawsuit." Of course, he didn't leave. No one leaves when things get truly interesting. The rest of the day turned into a psychological experiment. Now that I knew why Vivian was always nearby, I started noticing how often that nearby happened. She was at the west stairwell after chemistry, because she knew I cut through there to avoid the main crowd. She stood by the gym exit, because she knew I hated the main entrance on Mondays when buses clogged the parking lot. She was at the coffee truck on Tuesday morning before first bell. She had a cup in her hand and looked annoyed that the barista had given me a latte instead of my usual black. "You only drink sweet coffee when you haven't slept," she tossed out as she walked past. I stared at her back. "Do you even hear yourself?" "You looked rumpled," she threw over her shoulder. That was the key factor. And so it went with everything. Every interaction had gained a second body, a private logic, a thread leading back to the time when she was memorizing me before I even suspected it. The worst part was that I started understanding her without explanations. When Noah from chemistry came up to me on Wednesday and asked if I wanted to be his partner next week, Vivian materialized at my elbow within 30 seconds. "He already promised me," she snapped. I had promised nothing of the sort. Noah assessed her expression and wisely retreated. I turned to her. "You can't sign social contracts that don't exist." Vivian crossed her arms. "You weren't going to say no anyway." "That's not the point." "It is if I'm right." "You're impossible." "And yet." In that "and yet" was more damage than in all her previous attacks. She said it as if she already knew the answer. As if the fact that I hadn't run after seeing her apartment had taught her something dangerous. On Thursday after school, I found her by the side gate where the fence met the teacher's parking lot. I went there on purpose, and realizing that I was the one looking for her made me genuinely angry. She stood leaning against the railing, one earbud in. She saw me and for a second, just a moment, looked genuinely surprised. "Why are you here?" she asked, pulling out the earbud. "You know, that question loses its effectiveness when I've seen the evidence in your house." "That's not an answer." "Maybe I just wanted to get one." Vivian froze. I looked at the empty parking lot, then back at her. All the puzzle pieces finally fell into place. "You were always there because you knew my every move," I began. She said nothing. "You interrupted other people because you couldn't stand anyone else having access to me. You defended me not because you felt sorry for me, but because..." I exhaled. "You needed me to stay at your center." That hit its mark. Her gaze was fixed on me, but her expression changed. Less armor, more hunted. "So that's what this was all about?" I asked quietly. Vivian looked away. "You're describing it worse than it actually felt," she muttered. "How did it feel?" She was silent, and then, as if I had finally pulled her past the line where lies could still save her, she said, "It felt like, if I'm not there, someone else will take my place." I froze. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. It wasn't just jealousy. It was fear of being replaced. Not just a desire to possess me, but a need to remain the one person who was always there, always first, always the loudest in my life. "Vivian," I said more quietly, "this isn't bullying." "No," she replied. For the first time, she didn't argue, didn't joke or turn words into weapons, just no. And in that quiet syllable, all the school noise finally stopped pretending to be the main event. This was never an attempt to humiliate me. It was an attempt to keep me in her orbit. And now that I knew that, it was impossible to unsee. The real confession came on Friday, because honestly, neither of us could have survived another normal week. It was raining, a tedious gray rain, the kind that turns the school parking lot into a mirror for other people's bad decisions. I found Vivian under the canopy by the auditorium after the last bell, not by accident. This time, I walked with purpose. She stood with her hand in her coat pocket, watching the raindrops as if they had personally disappointed her. Hearing my footsteps, she didn't even turn. "You've started doing this too often," she observed. "Doing what?" "Finding me first." I leaned against the wall next to her. I suppose I was just learning from the master of unwanted encounters. She shot me a brief glance. "Terrible phrasing, even for you." Agreed. We stood in silence. Before, it would have been awkward, but now it was charged enough to light up a whole block. "You know what the worst part of all this is?" I asked, looking at the rain. Vivian didn't move. "I'm sure you have a whole list of candidates for that title." "I thought you hated me." That made her stir. Her face changed almost imperceptibly. "It was more convenient that way," she muttered. "For you or for me?" "Both." I turned my head and looked at her. In the gray light of the rain, her features seemed less sharp. The girl who had made my life a nightmare for the class president now looked like she was stuck in a story she couldn't control. "I wasn't your favorite target, Vivian," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. She said nothing, and in her world, that silence was the equivalent of a confession. "I was your favorite person." She closed her eyes. Just for a moment, but that was enough. And when she opened them, there was no room left for bully games. "Yes," she breathed. No jabs, no sarcasm, just a pure, heavy yes. It hit harder than I expected. Our entire old script had finally crumbled to dust. "This is bad," I said quietly. Vivian gave a bitter, tired smile. "I'm aware." "No, I mean, now all of this. It all makes sense." She looked at the wet asphalt. "You weren't supposed to see that room." "Sounds like a planning error." "Sounds like someone was following me." 1-1, I admitted. The rain grew louder. "I never wanted to bully you, Adrian," she suddenly said. I couldn't hide my skepticism. "Your behavior suggested otherwise for the last 4 months." "I know. It's just, I wanted your attention before I knew what to do with that desire." It wasn't a glamorous movie confession. It was humiliatingly honest. Still, why me? Vivian answered faster than before. "Because you didn't bend. Everyone else behaved predictably. They either fawned or feared. But you just got annoyed. You treated me like an insufferable person, not the queen of the school or a trophy. She looked at me point blank. At first, it pissed me off, and then I started craving it. Your real, unfiltered attention. I looked at her and understood. This was the worst confession I had ever heard. It was a description of an emotional catastrophe in real time. I should hate you, I said. You acted crazy, territorial, impossible, absolutely unhinged. Vivian froze. Real fear flickered in her eyes. Not fear of exposure, but fear that I would see all of this and decide that such love was too ugly to deal with. And, she whispered, do you hate me? I exhaled and smiled. No. The strangest thing about all of this is, no, I don't hate you. Her gaze at that moment was so open it made me almost uncomfortable. That was your big mistake, admitting this to me, she noted, but the ice was gone from her voice. Probably. I'll only get worse. I know. She laughed shortly, brittly, and then stepped toward me. You're making a terrible decision, Adrian. I think I made it the moment I followed you into the 3B lobby. That was the end, or the beginning. I pulled her to me, and when I kissed her, our whole history, all that strange, prickly war, instantly rearranged itself. Everything became simple. Not nice, not clean, but simple. My tormentor was never my enemy. I was simply the one she loved first, hardest, and in the most insane way possible. Crossing the line didn't turn Vivian into a different person. That's important to understand. She didn't suddenly become soft, accommodating, or the kind of girl who sends heart emojis in every message and says, I miss you, without obvious signs of emotional torment. No. Vivian remained Vivian. She still stole food from my tray, still incinerated any girl who acted too friendly with a single look, still looked at me like a problem she had first created and was now obligated to manage. The only difference was that now she would say, staying late at the library? Fine, I'll wait here. As if it were the most natural thing in the world. As if her life had always revolved around me and she had just stopped hiding it. The school, of course, noticed the changes instantly. Ava caught me by the vending machines on Monday and studied my face for a long time. You look different, Adrian. That sounds like the beginning of a thriller. You look like a man who's been officially privatized. I think that's illegal. In Vivian Evans's case, it's just a done deal. Mason was even less merciful. Watching Vivian unceremoniously grab my wrist in the hallway to drag me away from another conversation with Noah, he whispered, "Oh God, she finally unionized her obsession. Watching your happiness is a crime against every single person in this school." I advised him to suffer in silence. He replied that it was impossible in a world where my tormentor had become my girlfriend through the brute force seizure of my free time. With the official couple status, her strange behavior didn't disappear. It just started to seem like a very specific kind of domestic comfort. Our text exchanges now looked something like this. Vivian, did you eat anything with color today, or are you still living on the diet of a poorly guarded prisoner? Me. People usually express affection differently. But you understand me from the first word. Isn't that harmony? That was the essence of it. I understood her. I understood why she waited by my locker without even trying to pretend she'd gotten there by accident. Understood why she still rolled her eyes and whispered, I know, when her instincts made her jealous of every passing smile. Worse yet, my mom was absolutely delighted. Vivian called to ask which dessert you hate the least, she informed me one evening. Why do you have each other's numbers? Because I don't want to miss the most interesting thing in this life, Adrian. My integration into her world and hers into mine had gone like a classic hostile takeover. Fast, efficient, with no right to appeal. One evening at her apartment, I saw that black hoodie again. It was lying on the couch next to her while she made tea. I picked it up. "You're still keeping it?" "It fits the decor," she called from the kitchen. Frightening justification. But honest. I put it on and sat on the couch. When she came back with 2 mugs, she froze for a second, looking at me. "What?" "Strange to see it on you." "On its owner?" "Yes." I smiled. "You'd prefer it back on the chair as evidence?" Vivian sat down next to me. Not too close, but close enough that our knees touched. And then she said the phrase that explained everything. "I liked it when it smelled like you when you weren't here." I slowly turned my head. That's one of the most dubious romantic confessions I've ever heard. It's sincere. That's the problem. She almost smiled into her tea. And that was all of her. The girl who always loved wrong because she didn't know how to trust softness. She hated her own vulnerability, hated that I had seen her room, and was still angry at herself for letting her attention go so far before she found words for it. But she was happy, because her feelings were no longer locked in 3B. Now they were a reality we had both chosen. So yes, my bully was obsessed with me. She tracked my schedule, studied my habits, bought a car and hung my photo on the mirror like some holy artifact. She privatized my time and turned my social life into a sniper-patrolled territory. But in the end, it was simpler than I wanted to believe. She never tried to break me. She just didn't know how to love normally. And I, standing amid the wreckage of her hidden obsession, realized that I no longer wanted to leave normally either.
She found me first every morning. Knew my coffee, knew my mood. Stole my fries with no warning. Said my taste in food was crude. Every girl who said hello to me got a look she didn't see in the glass. And I called her insane, called her impossible. But the feeling, no, it wouldn't pass. She said I'm the only one who's truly paying attention. And the worst part was the truth in that confession. 3B, soft light on the floor, my hoodie on her couch like she'd had it before. 3B, she'd been keeping me close in a room full of pieces I didn't know she chose. Oh, she wasn't bullying, she was building a version of me. Oh, in the quiet she was feeling. 3B, the door barely closed, and I saw what she stole, and I saw what she chose. 3B, followed her home on a Friday. Pharmacy juice, brick on the street. Saw her tired, saw her sway. Saw the soft girl underneath the heat. Knocked on Sunday with a bag and a reason. Saw my pencil on her shelf, saw my notes on her board. Coffee brand, protein bars every season. She'd been collecting me, oh Lord. And she whispered, you finally noticed, like I should've seen it sooner. Said I never had a plan, just impulses with no future. 3B, soft light on the floor, my hoodie on her couch like she'd had it before. 3B, she'd been keeping me close in a room full of pieces I didn't know she chose. Oh, she wasn't bullying, she was building a version of me. Oh, in the quiet she was feeling. 3B, the door barely closed, and I saw what she stole, and I saw what she chose. She said, you didn't bend like everyone else. You gotta know you didn't bow, didn't melt lost in the night. Just craved it, every real thing you'd say. So I stayed in your orbit in the only way I knew how to stay. And I should have been scared, should have turned, should have gone, but the ring was so loud and the hand was so warm. She said I liked it when it smelled like you when you weren't here. And the worst, oh the worst was I felt the same fear of being replaced, of being unseen. She wasn't my enemy, she was my queen. Just terrified, just terrified, just terrified to mean it. The light's still on, my hoodie on me now, but the secret's not gone. She still steals my fries, still burns every girl with a look in her eyes. Oh, she's not soft, she's not sweet, she's a storm in a room with my photo on a mirror and my name in her bloom. I came back on Sunday and I never really left. Oh, I just stayed. You weren't supposed to see that room. Sounds like a planning error. She almost smiled, and the rain kept falling slower. 3B, she loved me first.